The moment arrives with a text, a call, a message that appears after weeks or months of silence. The avoidant person who withdrew, who ended things, who left you confused and hurt, has returned. They're reaching out, expressing some form of interest or regret, suggesting reconnection, or simply testing whether you're still available. This return is predictable in its timing and devastating in its impact because it activates every hope you've been trying to release, every wound you've been working to heal, every fantasy you've been attempting to let go. The temptation to respond with eagerness, to accept their return without question, to believe that their coming back means they've changed or realized what they lost, is overwhelming. But how you respond to the avoidance return determines whether you're walking back into the same painful dynamic that hurt you before, or whether you're protecting yourself while remaining open to genuine possibility. Most people respond to the avoidance return from a place of hope, relief, or residual attachment, accepting whatever scraps of attention or explanation are offered, and re-entering the relationship without addressing the patterns that led to the ending in the first place. This response guarantees repetition of the same cycle, the same eventual withdrawal, the same pain. The alternative requires responding from a place of clarity, self-protection, and genuine assessment of whether this person has actually changed or whether they're simply repeating their pattern of returning when their anxiety about loss exceeds their anxiety about intimacy. Understanding how to respond means evaluating their motivation, establishing boundaries that protect you, looking for concrete evidence of change rather than accepting promises, and most importantly, deciding what you actually want rather than simply accepting whatever they're offering because you're relieved they came back at all. Assess their actual motivation. For returning, the first and most crucial step when an avoidant person returns is assessing why they're actually coming back. The avoidance return is rarely motivated by the reasons you hope for. Genuine realization of your value, completion of therapeutic work on their attachment patterns, or development of capacity for the intimacy they previously couldn't handle. More commonly, the avoidant returns for reasons that serve their needs without representing any fundamental change in their capacity for relationship. Understanding their actual motivation allows you to respond appropriately rather than projecting the meaning you want the return to have. The most common motivation for an avoidance return is that their anxiety about losing you has temporarily exceeded their anxiety about intimacy with you. During the separation, the avoidant person's discomfort with intimacy decreased because they weren't experiencing it, but their awareness of having lost you, especially if they perceive you moving on or becoming unavailable, activated their attachment wounds around abandonment and worthlessness. This activation created different form of anxiety, the fear of being forgotten or replaced, and this anxiety can be strong enough to override their usual avoidance of intimacy. They return not because they can now handle closeness, but because losing you feels worse than the discomfort of trying again. This motivation means the return is about managing their anxiety rather than about genuine desire for relationship with you. If you accept the return and re-enter the relationship as soon as their anxiety about loss is resolved, as soon as they feel secure that you're not leaving, their anxiety about intimacy will reassert itself and they'll begin withdrawing again. The cycle will repeat because nothing fundamental has changed about their capacity. They've simply entered the phase of their pattern where pursuit feels necessary to restore their sense of control and importance. Another common motivation is that the avoidant person's other options didn't work out. They might have left you to pursue someone else or to explore being single, and those alternatives proved unsatisfying or unavailable. You represent familiar option, someone they already have some connection with, someone they know cares about them. Returning to you is easier than starting over with someone new or facing the loneliness they're trying to avoid. This motivation is entirely pragmatic and says nothing about your actual value to them. You're the convenient choice, not the chosen one, and accepting a return motivated by convenience guarantees you'll be discarded again when something more appealing becomes available. The avoidant might also return because they're going through a difficult period and need support or validation. They're struggling with work stress, family issues, life transitions, or simply feeling lonely, and they remember that you provided emotional support or made them feel good about themselves. They return not because they want relationship with you, but because they need something you provide, and they believe you'll provide it because you cared about them. This motivation is particularly manipulative because it uses your caring against you, relying on your emotional availability to meet their needs without any intention of reciprocating or meeting your needs in return. Some avoidants return out of guilt or obligation, feeling bad about how they ended things or concerned about how you're doing. They reach out to assuage their own guilt, to confirm you're okay so they can feel better about having hurt you, or to prove to themselves they're not a bad person who uses and discards people. This motivation is about their need to maintain their self-image rather than about genuine care for you or desire to repair the relationship. The outreach might seem kind, but it's fundamentally self-serving, designed to make them feel better rather than to address the harm they caused or to offer anything real going forward. Rarely, an avoidant returns because they've actually done work on their attachment patterns and believe they now have capacity for the relationship they couldn't provide before. This motivation is distinguishable from the others by specific markers. They can articulate what work they've done. They demonstrate understanding of their patterns and how those patterns hurt you. They take full responsibility for the relationship's ending without blaming you or circumstances. And they're not asking to immediately resume the relationship, but rather to slowly rebuild trust through changed behavior. If you don't see these markers, the return is not motivated by genuine change, regardless of what they claim. Assessing the avoidance motivation requires looking beyond their words to their actual behavior and circumstances. Words are easy and often crafted to achieve desired response. The avoidant knows what you want to hear, knows that expressing regret or acknowledging their patterns will make you more receptive to their return. But their behavior reveals their true motivation. How are they approaching the reconnection? Are they respectful of your boundaries and your timeline, or are they pushing for immediate return to the previous relationship? Are they willing to discuss what happened and what would be different? Or are they deflecting and wanting to move forward without addressing the past? Are they demonstrating changed behavior in their approach to you? Or are they already exhibiting the same patterns that characterized the relationship before? The circumstances of their return also reveal motivation. Did they reach out shortly after you stopped pursuing them or demonstrated that you've moved on? This timing suggests their return is about restoring their control and your availability, rather than about genuine desire for relationship. Did they return after a period where they were exploring other options, or after a breakup with someone else? This timing suggests you're the fallback, not the priority. Did they return during a crisis or difficult period in their life? This timing suggests they need support, rather than offering partnership. The context matters as much as the content of their communication. Your response to the avoidance return should be calibrated to their actual motivation, rather than to your hopes about their motivation. If they're returning because their anxiety about loss temporarily exceeds their anxiety about intimacy, engaging with them will restart the cycle and lead to the same ending. If they're returning because their other options didn't work out, accepting them back communicates that you'll accept being someone's backup plan. If they're returning because they need something from you, providing what they need without reciprocity continues the imbalanced dynamic. only if they're returning with genuine evidence of change and willingness to rebuild. Slowly does engagement make sense, and even then, it should be approached with clear boundaries and realistic expectations about the difficulty of changing deeply embedded patterns. Establish clear boundaries before re-engagement. Once you've assessed the avoidant person's motivation for returning, if you decide there's any possibility worth exploring, the next crucial step is establishing clear boundaries before any re-engagement occurs. These boundaries are not punishments or tests. They're necessary protections that create conditions where reconnection might be possible without immediately recreating the dynamics that caused harm before. Boundaries with a returning avoidant must address the specific patterns that made the relationship unsustainable, and they must be communicated clearly and maintained consistently, regardless of how the avoidant responds to them. The first boundary is that you will not immediately resume the relationship or the level of intimacy that existed before the ending. The avoidant person often wants to pick up where things left off, skipping over the rupture and the pain as if they never happened. This desire to avoid addressing what happened is itself a red flag, revealing they're not prepared to take responsibility for their patterns or to do the work of genuine repair. Your boundary must be that reconnection, if it happens at all, will be a gradual process that begins with casual contact and only progresses as the avoidant demonstrates through consistent behavior that they can show up differently than before. This boundary protects you from immediately reinvesting at a level that leaves you vulnerable to being hurt again in the same way. It also tests whether the avoidant person is willing to earn back your trust through patient, consistent behavior, or whether they're only interested in quick restoration of connection that meets their needs for validation without requiring them to actually change. Many avoidants will balk at this boundary, wanting immediate access to the intimacy and closeness that they previously couldn't handle and that contributed to their withdrawal. Their resistance to gradual rebuilding reveals they haven't developed the capacity to sustain intimacy, and they're likely to repeat their pattern of withdrawal once immediate needs for validation are met. The second boundary is that the avoidant person must be willing to discuss what happened in the relationship and in the ending, taking responsibility for their role without blaming you or minimizing the impact of their behavior. This conversation doesn't need to happen immediately, but it needs to happen before significant re-engagement occurs. You need to hear them articulate understanding of how their patterns affected you, acknowledgement of specific behaviors that caused harm, and genuine remorse that's not focused on making themselves feel better, but on acknowledging what you experienced. This boundary addresses the avoidant person's tendency to avoid accountability and to rewrite history in ways that protect their ego. If they cannot or will not have this conversation, if they minimize what happened or shift blame to you or circumstances, they're not prepared to be in healthy relationship. The conversation tests whether they've developed any insight into their patterns and whether they can tolerate the vulnerability of admitting fault and hearing how they hurt someone they claim to care about. Many avoidants will resist this conversation intensely, experiencing it as attack or as dwelling on the past rather than moving forward. This resistance reveals they haven't done the work necessary to show up differently. The third boundary is that the avoidant person must demonstrate specific behavioral changes, not just express intentions to change. Words about having learned, grown, or realized their mistakes are meaningless without accompanying behavior change. Your boundary should specify what behaviors you need to see: consistent communication without disappearing, follow through on commitments without chronic cancellations, emotional presence during difficult conversations without stonewalling, willingness to discuss the relationship and its trajectory without defensiveness, or whatever specific behaviors were problematic in your relationship. The avoidant must understand that you're looking for sustained behavioral change over time, not temporary improvement that will fade once they feel secure again. This boundary protects you from accepting promises and intentions as substitutes for actual change. Avoidants are often good at saying what they think you want to hear, especially when they're anxious about losing you. But behavior reveals truth. If the avoidant person cannot commit to specific behavioral changes or bristles at the suggestion that their behavior needs to change, they're not prepared for healthy relationship. If they agree to changes but then don't follow through, their agreement was performative rather than genuine. Your boundary must include your willingness to end the reconnection if behavioral changes aren't demonstrated and sustained. The fourth boundary is that you will not tolerate the hot and cold pattern that characterized the relationship before. If the avoidant person begins withdrawing again, creating distance, becoming inconsistent, or showing signs of their previous patterns, you will address it directly and immediately, rather than accommodating or hoping it will pass. This boundary communicates that you recognize their patterns now, and you will not participate in dynamics that harm you. The avoidant needs to understand that you're not the same person they left, that you've done work to understand what happened and to protect yourself, and that you will not accept treatment that disrespects your needs for consistency and presence. This boundary is particularly difficult to maintain because the avoidance patterns are deeply ingrained and will likely reassert themselves at some point. When this happens, your boundary requires you to speak up, even though addressing their withdrawal might trigger more withdrawal. This is where many people fail in reconnections with avoidance. They notice the patterns returning, but they don't want to rock the boat or push the person away. So they remain silent, and the dynamic reestablishes itself. Your boundary must include your commitment to your own well-being over the relationship's continuation, choosing to risk the relationship ending rather than accepting treatment that's harmful to you. The fifth boundary, and perhaps the most important, is that the avoidant person must be actively engaged in addressing their attachment patterns through therapy or other consistent work. Insight alone is insufficient. Good intentions are insufficient. Even genuine remorse and desire to change are insufficient without sustained work on the underlying patterns that drive the behavior. Your boundary should be that you will only consider serious reconnection with someone who is actively in therapy, specifically addressing attachment issues, and who can discuss that work with you. This isn't about controlling their healing or requiring them to be perfect. It's about ensuring they're taking responsibility for patterns that hurt people and investing in developing capacity they currently lack. This boundary will likely trigger significant resistance from the avoidant person. They may claim they don't need therapy, that they can work on things themselves, that requiring therapy is controlling or treating them like they're broken. These responses reveal they're not taking their patterns seriously, and they're not prepared to do the work necessary for genuine change. Someone who has actually recognized their patterns and their impact on others will understand that changing those patterns requires help. Someone who resists the idea that they need support in changing is likely not going to change at all. Your boundary on this point protects you from investing in someone who is not investing in themselves. Look for evidence of real change, not just words. If you've established boundaries and the avoidant person agrees to them, your next responsibility is to observe carefully for evidence of actual change rather than accepting words as proof of transformation. Avoidants are often articulate about their patterns when they're anxious about losing you, able to identify what they've done wrong and express intentions to do better. But this awareness and these intentions often evaporate once they feel secure that you're reinvested. Distinguishing between genuine change and temporary performance requires knowing what to look for and having the discipline to observe over time. rather than accepting early evidence as proof of lasting transformation. Real change in avoidant patterns manifests first in the small, daily behaviors rather than in grand gestures or declarations. The avoidant who is genuinely changed demonstrates consistency in mundane things, responding to messages within reasonable timeframes, following through on small commitments, being present during ordinary time together, maintaining regular contact without needing to be pursued. These small consistencies are actually more meaningful than occasional grand romantic gestures, because they reveal that the person can sustain healthy behavior in the unglamorous day-to-day reality of relationship. Grand gestures are easy for avoidance when they're anxious about losing you, but consistent daily presence is what they've always struggled with and what actually indicates change. The timeline of behavioral change also matters. Genuine change is gradual and sometimes includes setbacks as the person works against deeply ingrained patterns. If the avoidance seems perfect immediately, if they've suddenly become everything you wanted without any struggle or process, this transformation is likely performance rather than genuine change. Real change is effortful and visible as effort. You should see them catching themselves when they start to withdraw, consciously choosing different responses, occasionally discussing their discomfort with intimacy and their work to tolerate that discomfort rather than avoiding it. The struggle should be visible because changing attachment patterns is genuinely difficult. Suspiciously easy change suggests the person is performing temporary behaviors that will drop once the immediate threat of losing you is resolved. Real change also shows in how the avoidant person handles their discomfort and anxiety in the relationship. Previously, when they felt uncomfortable with closeness or overwhelmed by emotional intensity, they withdrew or created conflict to establish distance. If they've genuinely changed, you should see them experiencing discomfort, but choosing to stay present and to communicate about it rather than automatically fleeing. They might say, "I'm feeling overwhelmed and need some space, but I'll check in with you tomorrow," instead of just disappearing. They might acknowledge, "This conversation is difficult for me, but I want to work through it," instead of shutting down or deflecting. This ability to name their discomfort while remaining engaged represents fundamental shift in how they manage anxiety. The avoidance capacity for repair after conflicts or disconnections is another crucial indicator of genuine change. Previously, after conflicts or periods of distance, the avoidant likely avoided repair, hoping issues would blow over with time, or that you would do all the work of reconnecting. If they've changed, you should see them initiating repair, reaching out after conflicts, acknowledging their role in disconnection, expressing that they don't like the distance and want to resolve things. They should demonstrate that maintaining connection is important enough to them that they're willing to do the vulnerable work of repair rather than waiting for you to bridge the gap or simply moving forward without addressing what created distance. The avoidance response to your boundaries and needs is perhaps the clearest evidence of whether real change has occurred. Previously, when you expressed needs or concerns, the avoidant likely became defensive, withdrew, or dismissed your needs as excessive. If they've genuinely changed, they should receive your boundaries and needs without becoming defensive. They should be able to hear what you need without experiencing it as attack or pressure. They should demonstrate willingness to adjust their behavior to meet your needs rather than requiring you to suppress your needs to accommodate their limitations. This receptivity to your needs represents fundamental shift from the defended self-protective stance that characterized their previous approach to the relationship. Look also for evidence that the avoidant is doing their own work outside the relationship. Are they in consistent therapy? Can they discuss insights they're gaining and practices they're implementing? Are they reading about attachment and working to understand themselves? Are they developing other supportive relationships where they're practicing vulnerability and connection. The work of changing attachment patterns cannot happen only within your relationship. They need to be developing capacity for intimacy and vulnerability in multiple contexts, learning through therapy and other relationships how to tolerate and manage the discomfort that closeness creates for them. If all their supposed work is focused only on your relationship, it's likely performance designed to keep you rather than genuine healing work. The avoidance relationship to their past patterns is also revealing. Someone who has genuinely changed takes full responsibility for their previous behavior without excuses or blame shifting. They can discuss what they did wrong, how it hurt you, and what they're doing differently now. They don't minimize their past behavior or focus on what you did wrong. They understand that their patterns were their responsibility, regardless of what triggered them. This accountability represents maturity and insight that's necessary for sustaining change. If the avoidant still blames you or circumstances for their previous withdrawal, if they frame their patterns as reasonable responses to your behavior, they haven't developed the insight necessary for genuine change. Most importantly, you must give yourself enough time to observe patterns rather than judging based on short-term behavior. Avoidants can maintain changed behavior for weeks or even months when they're motivated by fear of loss. But the true test is whether changed behavior sustains over longer time periods and across different circumstances. Do they maintain consistency when life gets stressful? Do they stay present when conflicts arise? Do they remain engaged when you have needs or when the relationship asks something of them? Do they sustain their investment after the initial period when they're trying to win you back? These questions can only be answered through observation over months, not weeks. Rush to judgment about whether they've changed is one of the most common mistakes people make when avoidants return. Decide what you actually want, not what they're offering. The final and most important aspect of responding when an avoidant returns is taking time to decide what you actually want rather than simply accepting whatever they're offering because you're relieved they came back. The avoidance return often triggers such strong emotions that rational decision-making becomes difficult. You might feel relief, validation, hope, or even triumph that they came back. These feelings can obscure whether reconnecting actually serves your well-being and whether this person can provide what you need in relationship. The work of deciding what you want requires separating your emotional response to their return from clear assessment of whether relationship with this person can meet your actual needs. Start by honestly assessing what the relationship was actually like before the ending, not what you've romanticized it to be in their absence. During separation, memory tends to soften the difficult aspects and highlight the positive moments, creating distorted picture of the relationship that was. You need to remember the full reality, the anxiety their inconsistency created, the loneliness you felt even when you were together, the amount of energy you spent trying to figure them out or make them show up, the ways you diminished yourself or your needs to accommodate their limitations, the pain of their withdrawal, and the ending. This full accounting of what the relationship cost you is essential for making clear decision about whether to re-engage. Next, identify what you actually need in a romantic relationship, independent of what this specific person can provide. What level of consistency and reliability do you need? What degree of emotional presence and vulnerability do you require to feel connected? What kind of communication patterns make you feel secure? What trajectory toward commitment and future building is important to you? These needs should be defined based on what healthy relationship looks like, not based on what you think the avoidant person might be capable of providing. If you define your needs around their limitations, you'll end up accepting less than you deserve while convincing yourself it's enough. Once you're clear on your needs, honestly assess whether you believe this person can meet those needs based on everything you know about them and their patterns? Have they demonstrated capacity for what you need, or have they consistently shown they cannot provide it? Has their work on themselves been sufficient to create genuine change in their capacity, or are they still fundamentally the person who couldn't show up before? This assessment requires brutal honesty about the gap between what you need and what they can offer. Hope and attachment will try to minimize this gap, convincing you that small improvements are enough or that your needs aren't that important. Resist this minimization and stay clear about whether there's actual compatibility between your needs and their capacity. Consider also what re-engaging with this person will cost you. Reconnecting requires emotional investment and vulnerability that could result in being hurt again in the same ways you were hurt before. It requires time and energy that you could invest in healing, personal growth, or finding partnership with someone more capable of meeting your needs. It requires risk of repeating painful patterns and potentially emerging more damaged than you were after the first ending. Are you willing to accept these costs? Do you believe the potential benefit of reconnection justifies these risks? Or are you considering reconnection primarily because you've been longing for them and you're not thinking clearly about the costs? Examine whether your desire to reconnect is about this specific person or about filling the void their absence created. Have you been lonely or struggling since the ending, making any connection with them seem better than the isolation you've been experiencing? Have you idealized them in their absence, forgetting their limitations and focusing only on what you miss? Have you not fully grieved the relationship or moved through the process of accepting it's over, leaving you vulnerable to accepting them back before you're actually ready? These factors can drive decisions that aren't in your best interest, leading you to accept reconnection that will ultimately cause more harm. Think about what accepting them back communicates to them about your boundaries and standards. If they can leave, hurt you, and then return without having done significant work or without facing real consequences, you're teaching them that their patterns are acceptable and that you'll always be available regardless of how they treat you. This lesson increases the likelihood they'll repeat their patterns because they've learned there's no real cost to doing so. Sometimes the most self-respecting response to an avoidance return is to decline it, communicating clearly that their patterns were unacceptable and that you're not available for relationships that harm you, regardless of how much you might care about the person. Consider whether there are conditions under which you'd be willing to explore reconnection. Perhaps you need to see 6 months of them being in consistent therapy. Perhaps you need to start with very limited contact and see how they handle that over an extended period before considering more. Perhaps you need them to understand that you're also dating other people and you're not putting your life on hold while they figure out if they can show up for you. Conditions that protect you while allowing possibility are reasonable, and the avoidance response to these conditions reveals whether they're serious about change and about you. Resistance to reasonable conditions is evidence that they're not prepared for what real relationship requires. Think about what you've learned about yourself through this relationship and its ending. Have you recognized patterns in yourself that made you vulnerable to accepting less than you deserve? Have you done work on your own attachment patterns or wounds that made this relationship appealing despite its dysfunction? Are you now in place where you can maintain boundaries and standards you couldn't maintain before? The ending and separation should have resulted in growth and change in you as well, and reconnecting should only happen if you're confident you can show up differently than before, protecting yourself in ways you didn't before. Ultimately, the decision about whether to re-engage with a returning avoidant should be made from a place of clarity about what you want and need, realistic assessment of what they can provide, honest evaluation of costs and benefits, and genuine consideration of whether there are better ways to invest your energy and time. The decision should not be made from loneliness, from hope, that this time will be different, without evidence of actual change, from attachment that hasn't been properly processed, or from relief that you don't have to fully accept the ending. If you decide that reconnection makes sense, given all these factors, approach it with clear boundaries, realistic expectations, and commitment to protecting yourself if their patterns reassert themselves. But if honest assessment reveals that this person cannot meet your needs or that costs exceed benefits, the most self-respecting response is to kindly but firmly decline their return, continuing the forward movement you've been making without them.